honestly, my by the way, it's my birthday. The 4/11/1986. So if I had two bits of advice for Final Fantasy, and Square Enix, it would basically be this: you have too much ambition. You need to scale back significantly. Now, I know that is not exactly what much of the fandom wants to hear, but I'm not I'm not saying these games don't need to be everything, or that they don't need to be to have elements of everything, to have a storyline that includes the romance, the story, the war, the conflicts that exist in Final Fantasy and have always existed since the Harkin old days and everything. But what happened is more technical than story. What transpired at the cursed Final Fantasy 15 development. It you know pretty infamously and well understood is that the story isn't really so much the issue. I'm not saying scale back the ambitions of the story itself. I'm saying the technical side of this, the side that has to do with programming and not anything at all remotely to do with like storytelling and all that. What Square Enix did in practice is try to develop its own, engine for the project, which led to a nightmare a situation where the documentation on how to use this engine was not necessarily available. We were left waiting for manuals on how the engine. The developers were left waiting on manuals to actually utilize the features of the engine and to understand how to actually, you know, work with it and everything. And the it's just the engine, to make their own engine for the damn thing. And so my advice would be switch to Unreal Engine for Final Fantasy projects. Stop trying to make your own engine to do this sort of thing, because it's too much ambition. Like the rest of the industry has started utilizing Unreal Engine for a reason. It's time for Square Enix to face the reality. You really should not be trying to, create an engine and a game at the same time. What Unreal Engine does is enable you to free you up to focus on, the part that actually matters, making a game that people like want to play. And pretty infamously, I've seen that they've used this on some of their AA titles already. So they're already making that pivot in certain spaces. It's time for that pivot to come to Final Fantasy. This would be one of the most pragmatic bits of advice that I could give the company. You really need to stop. One of the big disasters that have happened, and happened almost entirely because they tried to make their own engine, and that they couldn't they couldn't face the reality that this is just too, like, you set your targets way too high, in that regard, and that's purely focused on like the technicals. That has nothing to do with saying the story doesn't need to be as intricate and complicated as it used to be, or anything that it does. But what I'm saying is that programming wise, the reason why people have outsourced the engine of these games to other companies and put that portion on them is that it's too much work for most companies at this point, and so that has been licensed to a third party. Now, in the old days, this may have been possible, but in the old days, games were not as big as they are now, and the graphics were not as sophisticated as they are at this point, and so that would definitely be part of my advice. Stop trying to design your own engine. Bad idea. Like Unreal, like, there's a reason why the West pivoted in this direction, because they got this. They intuitively understood it, and it's time for Japan to understand that, doing some things at a house is, in the interest of the company. Like, seriously. Unreal Engine has a whole crew of people, and it's not so hard for people to look up the documentation and, become aware of how to actually utilize it, because it's extensively documented and everything. Whereas, when you try to develop it in house, you don't just have to develop it. The team that's developing it also has to provide documentation for how to use it and everything, because only the developers are going to understand how the damn thing works and everything, and that knowledge transfer is going to have to be done. Somebody's going to have to write the instruction manual for it and everything, and then you're building up the entire scaffolding of the game instead of focusing on the game and the part that actually matters. It's not a good idea fundamentally. The other bit of advice that I'd give them is that when you try to make a game for everybody, you end up making a game for no one. You really need to. Another bit of information that I would give them, as well, as far as advice is concerned, is that gamers these days are absolutely fed up with things like NFTs, cryptocurrency, gotcha games, loot boxes, all that shit. Now, these may be real money makers for companies if they're able to execute on them. The problem is that there has been an active resistance to these things. I mean, these forces may exist on mobile platforms, but people like me have never ever used our cell phones to game because of this fact. We're trying to actively avoid it. We don't want to be treated like ATMs that they can just endlessly extract money from. We may be willing to shell out $60 to $70 on a fully, furnished game that has all the bells and whistles that we want out of a game, but we're not going to fucking constantly be paying, a bit of, bits and bits and bits of money in order to spin the loot box and everything and create a cash cow for this stuff. It's not negotiable. It's not happening. And your core fandom are a bunch of people that feel the exact same way. They're not going to fucking do this microtransaction shit, with cryptocurrency, where they're constantly feeding you a never ending stream of money for these projects. Give it up. It's just not happening. It's not in the cards for you as a company. So that's another bit of advice. And the next bit of advice that I would give them is that for whatever reason, your best project has been your most controversial. I don't know why that is, but this company has done incredible work when it turned controversial, as the strongest lore that I have ever seen out of you as a company would have to come out of Xenogears, which I'm a little bit perturbed and angry about, because you have the intellectual property, but you don't seem to want to do anything with it except maybe release a few figurines here and there. I would prefer to see the whole, 6-part game, all 6 games come out that were part of it. I want the full fucking thing. This is a fucking masterpiece. It was one of the best, games that I'd ever experienced, and one of the best stories that I'd ever sat through. I am a huge fan of Xenogears, and part of that particular cult. So my sentiments towards Square Enix is that when you take a risk of getting in trouble and offending religious sensibilities, you've actually done your best work. Although, to be fair, I don't want to be a spoiler channel for people going into Xenogears, but, when they talk about killing God, this is a Gnostic-inspired work, and so there's a false God that's, essentially entrapping God in a state where it is unnatural for it, so, yeah. The wave existence has been entrapped by the Zohar, and they're trying to use it as an energy source and everything, and it's complicated, but essentially you're not so much actually killing God as you are breaking him out of his prison and releasing him so that he can go back to the higher dimension that he's part of. Like, that would be the explanation for the truth of its religious themology. So, the person who developed this was a very countercultural, thinker, and everything, and she did a good job. The team that was behind this did an incredible job. It is one of the best. It is literally the best lore I have ever seen out of Square Enix as a company. And unfortunately, those little Xenoblade games, they're good, but they're not at the same level. They're not as good. As far as their lore is concerned, and I like them and everything, but comparatively, they're just not at the same tier of quality. So Monolith Soft has tried, but I guess they've kind of given up on releasing what the original vision of things was and everything. And so I would like to see Square Enix actually pick it up. And if you're not going to do that, then you're cash strapped currently. You're in a tight financial situation. You could potentially make some money by selling it to Monolith Soft, and I would advise you to do that. The rights, the fundamental intellectual property rights, sell it to somebody that will actually do something with it, because there have to be development studios that want to do it. Monolith Soft may be the first place I look, because a lot of the people that have worked on that project, that company left your company because they were frustrated about the constraints that were put on them about developing this particular game. It's pretty infamously part of the history that led into Xenosaga in the first place. So just an idea. If you're so cash strapped, you have an asset that somebody else might want to do something with. And right now, the only thing that you're doing with it is basically, releasing figurines here and there, which is, please stop. Actually, if you're gonna touch it, actually give us a game, with it. And like I said, so the twin demons that have haunted this company: self-censorship before the fact, especially given that we can see that their best work has been their most controversial. And too much ambition. Now, I'm not saying like I said, and the caveats that I'm issuing when I say too much ambition, I'm not really talking about the way that Final Fantasy is, the lore is a grand narrative, like we saw in Final Fantasy VI, where we have the Empire and its terrible, the terrible things it does, and then we have Kefka and his insanity. And then we have, good men like General Leo that just happen to be on the wrong side of the war in its complexity. And then, you ultimately have, bits of... bits... a piece of knowledge that, you just have these bits and pieces of knowledge that in this game that like what I was going to say is that the story is it has good romances, it has good as well on the side as part of subplots of the whole thing. I mean, there are subplots within this game, and it ends up being a very good game as a consequence of the complexity and ambition of its lore. It's one of the first times the companies really went balls to the walls to really release a very intricate lore, and they did a fucking phenomenal job of it. I have to applaud Final Fantasy VI for what it did. And plus, to share a memory of the game, the Opera House literally taught me that, an area is not necessarily something that isn't for me. The thing about it is that I went into the Opera House thinking opera, and classical music fans were a bunch of snobs that, thought of modern music as trash. And I was nurtured and raised on relatively modern music, and that these people were elitist. And, despite the fact that I didn't really necessarily have a thing against Mozart and, what he put forward and the old composers and everything, I just felt that maybe there was a bit too much elitism on behalf of those who were the fanboys of this stuff. So going into the Opera House, I felt that I was a sense of dread as I went into it, and everything. And when the song started, as it did, that dread was beginning to peak. But then, what I heard was one of the most beautiful pieces of music that I've ever heard in my life. And so I watched my expectations and my thinking and my perspective at the time that I was going into it dissolve under the realization that I had been quite wrong. This piece of music made me weep. It was that beautiful. The area reconfigured my understanding of things such that I realized that classical music had a place for me too. You know, it was literally that beautiful. And when I first experienced it, I was sitting there, with the NES as it started, the SNES, sorry, and everything, and my sense was it was incredible that something so beautiful could come out of a 16-bit, you know, rendition of things. And so, just that whole scene fundamentally changed my, understanding of things. So, I'm a big fan of the narrative complexity that went into their original. Now, the grand overview of the plot makes it sound a little bit too simple, compared to what the execution actually went through. And so the thing that I'd have to tell you is that I could tell you what the grand overview of the lore of Final Fantasy VI is, but if I do that, it's just not going to be as good as the game actually ended up being on execution of what took place. So the game doesn't sound as interesting as it actually is in practice. Just saying. And the thing about all this is that, having looked at some of the quality storyline writing, going into, the Endwalker and, the Final Fantasy 14, and Xenos and all that other stuff, I'm aware that there are people at Square Enix that still have the lore writing talent, but going into 15, I can tell you that it was developmentally a disaster, and then, what we got was laughable. I watched that whole thing, and, there was all that anticipation built up for meeting Lunafreya, and then before we got to know literally anything about her, she died instantly, which led to my laughing, because I don't care about this character. And of course, the characters don't seem too devastated. Noctis, who was supposedly in a romantic relationship with her, doesn't seem to give two fucks about any of it, despite the fact that his whole world has been turned upside down. The devastation that a normal person would feel is just not evident at all. There's no emotional outburst at all. So we're just left sitting there laughing hysterically at all of it, because the story is so bad that it reminds me of Darling in the Franxx after it jumped the shark, with the whole pivot to a completely different story than what we were expecting, and then everything going to, absolute crap until you're just laughing, because you can't take any of it seriously and everything. And so Final Fantasy 15 had terrible lore, terrible writing, and everything, and it goes far deeper than just, this is a story with four bros that I don't give a shit about the bonding between. I don't want to experience it. I never asked for this, theme of brotherhood, but, I didn't want it, and plus, on top of that, everything else that's there is crap, too. So, and then on top of all that, this company opened itself up to charges of sexism, because, you had done so well on women's rights, right? And then, they released Cindy, and, the lingerie mechanic lady that is just there to titillate the audience, and everything, and no women in the party and everything, which, when you've got such obvious, so incredibly obvious fan service in a game like this and everything, it just, and no women in the party, it basically opens you up to, hey, this is a little bit misogynistic, criticisms. Don't do that, basically, anyways, you've done so well, as far as women are concerned, by having, major female characters in Final Fantasy 7 and 10 and all this other stuff. So, just, yeah. So, that's. Thanks for coming to this particular TED Talk and everything. That's my advice for the company. Scale back those ambitions. Stop trying to develop your own engine. Stop the game of self-censorship. Final Fantasy 15 would have been much better written if you hadn't cut Stella and the original story from it. The new direction that you went through never had any promise to begin with. I think that anybody that has anything nice to say about Final Fantasy 15 is evaluating it entirely on the basis of gameplay, which I don't really care about. I come to the Final Fantasy fandom as a fan of fantasy fiction and writing and reading, and like a fan of the Wheel of Time and other series. I'm trying to work my way through The Hobbit recently with Audible and Andy Serkis because I am a reader, and I'm a fan of the literary world and literary, fantasy, and I'm basically, So I'm just saying all this, it would be pretty much the advice that I would have for the company as far as these things are concerned. I mean, if you do all this, you should at least, begin to turn back the tides. Now, my feeling about Final Fantasy, being better off making a cheap game is that it's easier to turn a profit when you don't spend $200 million making a game.